Hey, today's broadcast. Greatest pleasure to welcome back Gabriel Lafitte, who is an old-time friend of the Tibet movement and somebody who we hold in high regard. He's taught us an amazing amount of information about Tibet's environment and the development, and particularly he's taught us or shown us the analysis that he's done about China's policies on the environment and development in Tibet. So I'm delighted to welcome him today to talk to us about China's propaganda about the climate and the green issues that it is trying to push forward at the moment. And Lobsang, our very own environment expert at Tibet Network, is going to moderate for us. So I'm going to pass over to you, Lobsang.
Thank you, Mandy. Hello, everyone. Tashidile. Welcome to our fifth Tibet Climate Crisis Talk. And so this time I'm very happy to introduce and to have with us Mr. Gabriel Lafitte, a very old good friend of Tibet, and he has been working tirelessly. And I would say, he has been one of the most dedicated person who has worked on issues related to Tibet's environment, and I have known to him for a really long time. And so he almost worked with the Tibetan community for almost like 30 years. And then his book, which is also one of my favorite, Despoiling Tibet, China and its national resource nationalism, is one of a very important book regarding mining inside Tibet. And then I would also like to recommend our viewers Gabriel's very famous website, rukor.org, has lots of latest informations on Tibet's nomad and all the latest update resources on Tibet's environment. And I find that this is like very useful for the issues related to Tibet. And so today Gabriel will talk about decoding CCP's climate propaganda. So meaning the Chinese government, they have introduced lots of policies and regarding environment policies inside Tibet. So when they introduce the environment policies, so they use phrases, they use quotes, and they use lots of slogans. And this slogan, I feel that they have been using the environment-related slogans long time back. Even during the period of Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, they were also talking about green development, sustainable development, and then Xi Jinping also talks about ecological civilization and green GDP, green development. But then question is how much that slogans, how much these policies get effect in reality, and how much that brings a ground reality and it impacts on the ground level. And like that, Chinese government has introduced various slogans and policies related to Tibet. And so Gabriel over here, he will decode these slogans and these policies, and then he will tell us what are these policies actually mean and how does that impact on Tibet's environment, its land, its people. So thank you so much, Gabriel, and then over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Lovyang La. Propaganda. What does the very term propaganda mean? Almost by definition, we know that somebody's trying to sell something to us, they're trying to persuade us, they're trying to turn our minds in a certain direction, and by implication at least, that means they may also be trying to conceal something from us that they don't particularly want us to know. Of course, given China's capacity to generate and to spread propaganda, since all official media, whether it's radio, television, online, print, whatever, are all controlled directly by the Communist Party. Their capacity to generate the campaign slogans that China runs on, mostly for domestic consumption, across China and in Tibet, they are everywhere. Those slogans are everywhere. And yet, surprisingly, in a way, they remain almost incomprehensible, not only to us outside Tibet, but in my experience of talking with many of the Tibetan intellectuals, because translating Chinese propaganda from Chinese into Tibetan, and especially into officially approved Tibetan, is a major industry, precisely because China does insist that its message in Chinese to Chinese audiences, in English to Western audiences, also has to be translated day in, day out to Tibetans in Tibetan using officially approved translations. So if you are an educated Tibetan inside Tibet, given a good, secure job by the government, it turns out to be basically cutting and pasting Chinese propaganda terms into standardized Tibetan propaganda terms. And, if you can quietly ask some of these people, well, what do these terms actually mean? To my surprise, they often say, well, I don't really know either. So propaganda is, on the one hand, meant to convey a message, and yet so often it fails precisely because it's a formula, because it just insists on using exactly the same phrases all the time. So I often used to say to Tibetans I was working with who were trying to understand China, and that's an incredibly important and relevant thing to try to do, to just simply get a sense of what are China's real intentions, what are China's plans, what does China have in mind for Tibet? Can we know in advance? How do we figure out? And yet the reality is that when we try to find out, what is most accessible is just simply propaganda. And I often used to say to Tibetans, look, if all you are accessing is China's propaganda, you're beating your head against a wall. That's the hardest way to find out. But I think finally we do have to face it. We do have to decode it. We do have to actually get through the rabbit hole and out to the other side and actually discover, discern, assess, analyze, and figure out what it actually means. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes, and this is just a quick look. If anybody wants to look a bit more deeply at the handful of specific propaganda phrases that we've chosen for today to discuss after this initial presentation, then please do go to the website that Lobyangla mentioned, ruko.org, because today there is a new post that goes into much greater depth on the specific terms that we are discussing now. But let's turn to those terms. So let's Mandy, have the first slide, and which is just here we go. Just an introduction and a reminder that this is part of a project of the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy, based in Dharamsala, the only human rights monitoring agency in the world, created, staffed and run by Tibetans. and the website www.ruko.org. So let's move on, Mandy. So it's important to remember what propaganda does. Several political scientists have been making the point recently that the Communist Party, since it's clearly in command of the government, clearly regards itself as the only legitimate political actor in China. Nobody else is allowed to do politics, only the core leader. They have to constantly mobilize people. Communist Party rule is driven by campaign slogans, or you might also call them official memes. So we need to be able to unpack and to decode, to reveal the inner meanings that reveal what China actually intends. And in this particular year of 2020, that this is a really crucial year, as we'll discover. Let's move on to our first slogan, an extremely vague and diplomatic one that was not invented by China, but they have seized upon it and trotted out all the time. And it's not exactly obvious. Oh, I don't know, maybe it is. It'll be interesting in a few minutes to get your comments. Common but differentiated responsibilities. It sounds sort of nice. It sounds a bit vague. But if we think carefully about how and where China uses it and how China has lobbied various United Nations agencies to get this phrase inserted into international treaties, and they've been quite successful on that. Common but different. So yes, common responsibilities. We all have common responsibilities to make the world a better place, to deal with climate change. But the insistence on accepting in a very broad, vague, undefined, general sense, common responsibilities, the key word for China is differentiated. China demands to be different. China wants to be both a developed and a developing country. China insists on being exceptional, that it is full of Chinese characteristics, and those are all that count. China is not bound by global rules, by universals. China does not accept that simply to be born human automatically confers human rights on you. It's a cultural thing. So China is not required to take effective climate action. And in fact, if you look at the fine print of the documents China lodges as its official report to the climate change negotiation, it's actually demanding over this coming decade, 2020 to 2030, a payment from the richer countries of 13 trillion renminbi over the coming decade, because China is a developing country, not a developed country. So it's a way of China denying that it is the world's biggest polluter, that China mines and burns more coal than the rest of the world put together every year, and that as China recovers from the coronavirus, pollution levels and carbon emissions have gone right back up again, and yet China has never actually committed to a specific carbon emissions reduction target. And under the rather weak rules of the Paris Climate Change Agreement back in 2015, which will be reviewed, it was meant to be this year in Glasgow, now it's going to be next year in Glasgow, China has failed to announce any specific emissions reduction target. They've instead insisted only, and the rules of the Paris Agreement unfortunately are too weak to overrule them on this, simply an energy efficiency target, that is the amount of energy per unit of a gross national product, which doesn't necessarily, in fact it doesn't, reduce emissions at all. So that is a bland piece of diplomatic jargon that actually hides a very awkward reality. And China knows that the rest of the world knows that China is now the world's biggest polluter. So what can China do about it? Let's move on, Mandy, to slogan 2. Again, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, is particularly relevant for 2 reasons this year. First of all, the conference of the parties, that is every country that is a signatory to this convention, and just about every country on Earth is due to meet and to make decisions for the fate of all threatened species, all species threatened with extinction. And yet, although China is actually due to be the host in Kunming of this crucial meeting, which will decide the fate of all threatened species, especially over this crucial coming decade, the reality is that it's come at a really embarrassing time for China, when the whole of the world has realized where the coronavirus came from, that it originated in the wet markets, where all sorts of wild animals caged on top of each other, all of their natural wastes mingling with each other, an ideal environment for viruses to jump from one species to another. So the fact that China has earned the right to stage this meeting of all governments to decide the future of all wildlife over the coming decade is being held in Kunming raises the really crucial question: will China allow Tibetan voices to speak up, for animals to be the voice of the animals, the voice of the voiceless, and equally for Tibetan pastoralists, who traditionally have always mingled their domestic herds with wild herds, with the antelopes, the gazelles that flock across Tibet and migrate at this time of the year to give birth to their young in safe areas, just at the same time as the pastoralists are also moving into their summer pastures. So how will that work if China is going to host the planet's efforts to save all threatened species in a crucial year, when China is facing the embarrassment of being known as the world's greatest wildlife trafficker, with insatiable demand for consuming wildlife? How's that going to work out? Is that going to encourage China to allow other voices, or is it only going to exacerbate their authoritarianism? No, let's move on. Next one. And I should emphasise, by rushing through these, maybe at a slightly hectic pace, we will slow down shortly and open up for discussion. So I hope people are using the chat function to write questions or comments. Now, our third slogan, again, one that China has borrowed and that is already familiar to us: the national park system. China intends to announce this year, maybe again this might be delayed because of the virus, a whole system of national parks which by area are very much concentrated in the Tibetan plateau. Now, the national park is such a good idea. It's almost like a no-brainer. Who could possibly be against a national park? Almost by definition, it sounds like something really positive. And if, as Lobyang La mentioned, there has been mining in many remote areas of Tibet, surely a national park is a step in the right direction, because after all, it's meant to create protected areas, to protect nature from exploitation, extraction, mining, and also, hunters randomly and cruelly shooting the wildlife, etc. All of which, have been happening in Tibet in recent decades. However, we always, as with, and this is, I guess, why I'm putting this in, this little list of propaganda terms, we have to ask, what does China mean by national park? Does China mean the same as, the national parks that we are used to visiting in wherever we live? Well, China talks about growing more grass, and that's a propaganda phrase in itself, twee mu huan sao, closing pastures to grow more grass, because this captures carbon. So the national parks will become a wilderness of primordial grassland from which more and more of Tibet's traditional Drogpa nomads are to be removed in the name of carbon capture, in the name of climate adaptation. And of course, where do the nomads go? They go to live in urban settlements. So policing nomad removals to go to live in urban settlements where they depend on government rations is now to be implemented under the new national park system by employing one person in each nomad family who will be called a park ranger. So park ranger, like a national park, we've met park rangers at the national parks we've visited. They're nice people. They're there to help us. They're there to help the wildlife. They're there to protect. But what is the job of a park ranger? Well, since we are talking about propaganda, let's take a break for a moment and actually look at some recent Chinese propaganda just for a few minutes. And this is all about one of the national parks. Is there any sound?
See. Since the mid-20th century, the destructive scale of man-made emissions, deforestation, and species extinction have led to an era some scientists are calling the age of the human. However, green development has become a key concept for China, now the world's largest producer and consumer of renewable energy sources. I've come to Qinghai province, home to Sanjiang Yuan, the source of three rivers, to find out exactly how China's environmental improvements include preservation, protection, and a transition away from high-carbon industries into clean energy. Located in the heart of the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, Sanjiang Yuan is a vast landscape of great ecological significance. A key example of the country's focus on conservation, this is just one of the areas in which China is strengthening its green development concept. A vast grass and wetland with ripe forests and diverse wildlife, protection from human activity and climate change has become crucial for its preservation. Hi. 你好. 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 So we go? Many local farmers here have now become ecological patrolmen to help monitor the surrounding local environment. Sorso is taking me to one particular area that he is personally in charge of on his bike. Sorso is one of the many ecological ranges in Sanjiangyuan. In line with the integrated management of water, grasslands and lakes, Usho and Guolor have introduced jobs in ecological management and protection for the local community, in a bid to achieve both preservation for the environment and poverty alleviation for the herdsmen. For example, in Madwar County, more than 200 herdsmen have become rangers, protecting their homeland. Sorso has now served as a ranger for many years, witnessing both the disappearance and gradual return of the wild animals in this area. Local residents, guided by green development concepts, have also continued to improve their environmental awareness. A bull-head-like.
Okay. So, what was our park ranger, our handsome comfort warrior, actually saying? Interestingly, there was no translation. Now, back one slide, please, Mandy, just to slide 4. What was he telling us? There was no translation. What we do get is this nice young English woman telling us all these exciting developments that are happening, but not. And this little quite sophisticated propaganda version, filmed with quite professional equipment to keep a steady camera on this nice young woman on the back of a motorbike bouncing across Tibet, was made, of course, via China's official media and broadcast on official media, but sufficiently presentable to then be played on media around the world, especially in developing countries that don't have the finance to generate a lot of content themselves, and it's it's attractive, it's plausible. It sounds like Tibet is part of the answer to the world's problems. Renewable energy, protecting wildlife, protecting not only animals but lakes and mountains. That is the sort of issue that we really, I think, need to come to grips with and to explain. So let's look at the area that she's talking about and the key term that China has invented, Sanjiangyuan. Sanjiangyuan doesn't really have a direct translation into Tibetan. It does have an official translation. You're looking at it right there, a couple of different versions. But really all it is actually a transliteration. In other words, it sounds roughly the same in Tibetan, because what it means literally is the three river source, which is a highly misleading phrase because it really refers to the glacial origins of the two great rivers of China, the Yellow and the Yangtze, and also the Mekong of Southeast Asia, because all of them rise in Tibet, fairly close to each other in deep inland of Qinghai, and by packaging them as the Sanjiangyuan, you actually close other meanings. And in that little propaganda video we saw, we saw that young woman referring to Yushu and Golok, two huge prefectures, and there are more counties beyond Yushu and Golok that are included in the Sanjiang Yuan. They are effectively erased. We are encouraged by this new coinage, this new term, this new phrase, Sanjiang Yuan, the Three River Source, to see this landscape suddenly as being no longer really part of Tibet, but part of China, tilted towards China. The source of the rivers, the source of China's water supply, China's #1 water tower, to quote another propaganda phrase. So it's a huge area. It's an area the size of Germany. And climate zoning laws and regulations will prohibit any human use of core areas on the theory that they will somehow magically by themselves recover from desertification and degradation. The desertification China blames on climate change, and the degradation on ignorant nomads. And we'll have more to say about China's view of why nomads are so ignorant a little later. I mentioned a moment ago the slogan, closing pastures to grow more grass, 推木换草, which magically will capture carbon out of the air and improve China's reputation and remedy its existing position in the world's imagination as the world's biggest carbon emitter. So Sanjiang Yuan is going to do a lot of work for China, and that's why they're putting in all this effort into propaganda. Now, a lot of my Tibetan friends are very optimistic that national parks will be good, and hopefully they're right. But I still think there's a propaganda element at the very least, and we need to clarify and nail what exactly that propaganda means. So we'd better move on and make sure we've got time. A couple more slogans, and I'll try and do them quickly. One of the justifications for China's removal of nomads and also impoverishment of Tibetan farmers and nomads is the need to turn farmland into forest, which of course doesn't really apply to Tibet, because in Tibet most of the land in fact is naturally grassland rather than forest, but where farmers have been required to plant trees, it often reduces them to poverty, because they do officially get survival rations as minimal compensation for the lost crop production. And meanwhile, areas that were logged, completely stripped of their forests in Kham, have not been effectively reforested. So again, it's a seductive slogan, an attractive slogan, grain to green, reforesting, but again, it needs to be looked at a bit more carefully. And slogan 6 moves us on to the flip side, you might say. This is, again, a phrase that in English sounds a bit jangly. What on earth does contiguous, destitute areas mean? But we're giving you both the official Tibetan translation of this official phrase and the Chinese version, and you can see that contiguous, destitute areas is in fact the phrase that China uses in English, and it is an accurate translation. What it really means is it's a fancy propaganda phrase that justifies racism. It's saying that Tibetan geography is Tibetan fate. It's asserting that Tibetans are poor because of the nature of the land and the air of Tibet. That Tibet lacks heat, it lacks oxygen, it lacks market access. In fact, it lacks everything. what economists call factor endowments. In other words, poverty is inherent to the landscape. Or another way of putting it would be to say that no one would choose to live there if they had a choice. So wouldn't it be nice if China actually gave these poor Tibetans a choice of moving, even if the choice turns out to be a compulsory one. So China benevolently lifts the destitute Tibetans out of poverty by displacing them, by cancelling their land rights and moving them to urban fringes. So this slogan is a slogan that provides another basis, another justification for depopulating Tibet. So you put the two together and you end up with climate change plus poverty alleviation are both good reasons for depopulating huge areas of rural Tibet. And slogan 7 is the flip side of the contiguous destitute areas. This is, again, a derogatory, arrogant, racist way of defining the traditional Tibetan attitude to life, relying on heaven. What it really means is that uncivilized people basically live like they're animals. They're all just sort of wandering about randomly, looking for grass, dependent on nature, hoping heaven will provide. How pathetic, how backward. Civilized people, by contrast, dam rivers, irrigate crops, fence their animals, bring fodder to the animal pens, master nature, and above all, accumulate and accumulate and accumulate wealth, which again Tibetans conspicuously fail to do in Chinese eyes. So Tibetans have failed to use their land productively. They don't produce a whole lot of meat for Chinese consumption or anything much else, and they fail to use their land sustainably in a time of climate change, because there's degradation and threatened species and desertification. So what it all adds up to is, Tibetans don't need to, don't deserve to live in Tibet. So one last slogan, number 8. China can not only improve the land of Tibet by removing Tibetans, but it can also improve the skies and the clouds of Tibet by building a sky river. And again, the fact that it's got both an official Tibetan translation and, of course, a Chinese original for this phrase, tells you that, this is the thing, this is the concept. What it really means is that climate change requires greater effort to control the Tibetan skies as well as Tibetan landscape. High-tech, artillery, firing rockets to seed the clouds with chemicals and specifically to induce those clouds to make more rain over the uppermost reaches of especially the one river that runs dry many winters, the Machu, as Tibetans call it, the Yellow River, the Huanghe. However, this tech fantasy has its doubters, including plenty in China, who say that conquering skies can't be done, especially when China still to this day, despite the scientific expeditions and all the scientific research, still knows so little about Tibet in almost every dimension. However, if it could be done, if cloud seeding, building the sky river, what a romantic concept, if it could be done, the net result would be that it would deprive areas even further inland at the very, very tail end of both the Indian monsoon and the East Asian monsoon. It would deprive those areas of rain by forcing it to rain earlier. And where are those areas? That is precisely the area that China lobbied UNESCO successfully to declare in 2017 as the Hochschild UNESCO World Heritage Area. So China is bound to protect it. And yet, at the same time, they're planning to deprive an alpine desert of the only rain it ever receives, which is in summer. How does that work? That's a very, very quick run through some of China's key propaganda terms and this project of the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy and www.ruko.org will continue to decode in some depth lots and lots of China's propaganda terms. We've just selected a handful here. So the latest post on ruko.org looks at these particular terms that we've just discussed here in much greater depth, including a lot of the traditional cultural resonances deeply embedded in Chinese culture, so that you get some idea of what it evokes in Chinese readers, Chinese listeners. Now, let's go over to our moderator, Lobsang Yangso, and see whether anybody's been asking any questions.
We can't hear you, Lobsang.
That's right, I can't hear you.
I can't hear you at all, Lobsang. Sorry. Do you have a mic available? Sorry, everyone. Lobsang is in northern India, and they have had issues with their power today and yesterday where she's living. Until Lobsang sorts out her microphone, I will step in. Can we hear you, Lobsang? Oh, you can hear us. Oh, there you go. Coming in on us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm so sorry. I was using my laptop and then I think over there. So now I have jumped to mobile. Gabriel, for my question is that, your presentation, it's like very vast and very resourceful. And you have covered really important concepts that is related to specifically for Tibet's nomad and then also to Tibet's landscape as such. So when I see your presentation and when we observe what is happening inside Tibet, so I feel that, and China has seen Tibet as the beautification project where, Tibet has to look beautiful. Tibetan people, they have to look happy. And in this beautification project, so Tibet is a land which is supposed to consume by the Chinese, and by creating nature reserves or by creating national parks or building lots of infrastructure developments. But the question remains, the question is, when this whole process of the Chinese project of beautification of Tibet, so where does the Tibetans stand in this whole process, and so what are their roles, and how much the Tibetan people are involved in this Chinese beautification project? So that is my question to you, Gabriel.
Right. Well, I think, Lobsang La, you've hit on something that, is a mixture. I think China is in flux. Let me put it this way. When China talks about, the pristine beauty of Tibet, is it just propaganda? Is it just marketing? Is it just trying to persuade domestic Han tourists to, spend their money and take their holidays? I mean, obviously not right at the moment with the virus shutdowns, but in recent years there have been as many as 25 million domestic Han lowland Chinese tourists a year arriving just in Lhasa, which is, the most extraordinary overload for quite a small town like Lhasa. And China is trying to diversify the tourist destinations, and that will obviously include the national parks. And yet, it seems to me that the Chinese people generally are developing a real passion for Tibet, a real appreciation. Maybe it's precisely because they live in such crowded cities that the spaciousness, the solitude, as well as the beauty of the Tibetan landscape really strikes them. And I think it's also because contemporary Chinese urban life is so highly competitive. It's a constant struggle to, send your children to a cram school, to study, even outside of school hours, because, the pressure to succeed to get into a university or whatever is so intense that, Tibet stands as an opportunity to really relax and really just, reconnect and rediscover who you are. So China seems to me right now to be, really quite ambivalent. China, talks in quite racist terms about how uncivilized the Tibetans are because they are part of nature, in harmony with nature, and yet at the same time, Xi Jinping thought embraces the idea, he constantly talks about the need for living in harmony with nature. So when my Tibetan friends say, well, look, national parks will do a lot of good, I can certainly sympathise in the sense that, maybe it will tame Chinese minds. But the reality also is that all of these climate change-driven propaganda phrases all lead towards depopulating Tibet, and in a very calculated way, by insisting that the park rangers, one of whom we met in that propaganda video, wearing his finest silk chuba, which of course he always wears whenever he's doing his park ranger duty on his motorbike. All Tibetans wear their vest chuba all day, every day. Everybody knows that. From a Tibetan point of view, it's laughable as propaganda, but maybe other people wouldn't really sort of notice that. The fact that the Chinese are really proud of selecting one person from every nomad family to be a state employee whose primary duty as a park ranger is to make sure that your fellow Tibetans are obeying the rules, and if the rules say that in this area, which has been designated on supposedly scientific grounds as a protection area in which no human activities are allowed, then you are the one who actually does the policing. So instead of, the picture that we've often had in the past of heavy-handed Chinese cadres coming charging out to some remote village or nomad encampment in their jeeps and, speaking Chinese because so few Chinese ever learned Tibetan, and, barking orders and ordering Tibetans to leave their land, this is a much subtler and much more intimate form of control. So you could also say that, this is part of the growing sophistication of propaganda.
Okay. Thank you, Gabriel. And we have a question from Kate Saunders, and she said, I wonder if you are seeing any change in language used on Tibet's environment since the COVID pandemic. For instance, use of slogan terms like ecological civilization.
Kate, that's an interesting question. Yes, of course, the whole idea of propaganda is that it fits the times. And the times that we live in with the coronavirus pandemic, I think in some ways have complicated things for China, since the wet markets and the appetite for wildlife seems to have really created a lot of confusion in people's minds, or even the suspicion voiced by all sorts of people that this really was China's fault. But China has changed its propaganda message quite decisively in that particular area by announcing a new law which was passed just a few days ago by the National People's Congress, and it's worded in a way that sounds, quite sharp, clear, precise, and specific. It's a law, denouncing and forbidding and making totally illegal the eating of wildlife. That sounds terrific, until, again, you look at the fine print. While it comes down very, very heavily on eating wildlife, that is, going to a wet market, buying a live animal, a wild animal, some exotic wild animal that is desirable precisely because of its rarity, more than anything else, and you have it killed on the spot and take it to your restaurant, or the restaurateur buys it and cooks it for you, and you eat it, which is a way of simply showing off how rich you are. But when you look at the fine print beyond the quite fierce language in the propaganda title of the legislation, you discover that actually the use of wildlife animal parts in traditional Chinese medicine continues to be allowed. The farming of wild animals in cages continues to be allowed, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's an entrenched industry. It's a politically powerful industry. And of course, since China insists that everything has to have Chinese characteristics, how do you treat coronavirus infections? With traditional Chinese medicine. And there are traditional Chinese medicines on the market that boast to this day that they contain leopard bones, tiger bones, rhino horn, and one formulation that supposedly contains rhino horn was officially recommended as a coronavirus infection treatment. So yet again, while China's language, propaganda language, mutates as viruses mutate, we always have to look at the fine print beyond the propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gabriel, another question that we have is from Rinzin Dorji. And he says that as we know, ongoing pandemic has impacted downturn of China's economic. So will this lead to Chinese digging mine inside Tibet to fill their economic loss?
Will it? What was the last sentence again?
Will it lead to Chinese, digging? Will it lead more mining in Tibet?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not quite sure what to say, because on the face of it, the whole idea, for example, of protected areas of national parks is that the entire range of human activities, but especially economic activities, is meant to stop. and that certainly includes mining and the rhetoric, the propaganda, the regulations, the new scientific institutions, the zoning of land within national parks as either into three categories: core, buffer, and experimental. The core zone is meant to be a very strict one in which no human activities of any sort are allowed other than scientists, of course. And the buffer zones are extremely restrictive, and the experimental zones, nomads are still allowed, at least for the time being. But do national parks, nature reserves, officially protected areas, technically they're slightly different categories, do they actually prevent mining? Well, I've met some of the world's leading conservationists who are famous for the work that they have done in Tibet, and they tell me quietly, they would never say this publicly, that they have seen mining continuing in protected areas. Whether that is, it's just human nature. There's still corruption, no matter how much Xi Jinping is trying to crack down on it. These are the excuses that people give. I think in reality, in China, local government, that is, county and village governments, totally depend on local enterprises to generate revenue at a time when China has downshifted responsibility for financing and administering healthcare and education and social services to local governments without the local governments having the revenue to do it. So local governments have a very strong motivation to look the other way when enterprises like mining happen in Tibet. So one of the slogans that we didn't cover but could have is, the Great Western Development Program, which was announced in 1999, Shiwu Da Kaifa, which I think should more properly be translated as opening up the West for extraction. Calling it the Great Western Development Program is sort of slightly sugarcoating it. A lot of Tibetans assumed that this was aimed at developing Tibet, and yet in reality most of the money over the past 20 years that has gone to that program actually went to Chengdu and Chongqing, huge cities which wanted to attract the world's biggest corporations, and they boast that nearly all of the Fortune 500 top global corporations have all established factories in Chengdu and Chongqing. Well, where do they get their raw materials from? These cities are at the foot of the Tibetan Plateau. The rest of China, or China's traditional factory economy, is used to importing raw materials from overseas, from its mines abroad. But if you are a factory producing, let's say, electric cars in Chengdu or Chongqing, and you need lithium for your batteries, are you going to import that lithium from Chile, from South America, or are you going to get it from Tibet? I think, the question points us towards the reality that the large-scale exploitation of the minerals of Tibet has not happened as quickly as some of us feared it might, but it is nonetheless continuing to develop, and it could be that if the coronavirus is part of the de-globalization of the world and the decoupling of economies, then certainly China may turn more and more to exploiting the resources of Tibet. So it's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Gabriel, that's very interesting, and also I think the Chinese project of building national parks in Tibet. I think from your presentation and what we realize is that the national park there does not stop the Chinese government to do mining. and then it does not in a real world, it does not really help the Tibetan nomads, because at the end they get to lose their livelihood, and their economic condition has not really improved. So it also has a lot of political implication. I feel that, because once you once you declare a huge land as a national park, then it is the state that owns the national park, and whereas the people, they have to give away the land to the state, and then at the end the control of the land goes to the state, and then people become landless, and that also has I feel that really a big political impact, where people they become reliable to state subsidies, and so that's what we have seen. So another important issue I think we have been discussing in our previous climate talk is that also what is the relation between the Belt and Road Initiative and then its impact on Tibet's environment, whether the Chinese government's project of Belt and Road Initiative has a direct impact on Tibet's environment, or is it just that all the infrastructure development that we see has nothing to do with the Chinese project of Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, thanks for the reminder about the literal meaning of national park. A national park does, as you say, belong to the nation. It is a nationalisation of local lands and making them a state project. As for the Belt and Road, that again is a classically vague propaganda term that can mean just about anything. So in one sense, you could say that the Belt and Road is China's plunging into the sea in all directions, creating links with neighbouring countries and over the oceans with countries right around the world, all of which bypass Tibet, because Tibet, remains too difficult, too high, too cold, the people too unhappy with China for China to be able to succeed in nearly all of its interventions and projects. And yet, at the same time, China is trying to do in Tibet what it is doing with its Belt and Road outreach. One recent initiative, for example, only a few weeks ago, and I don't think that many people have heard of this yet, is to establish feedlots to take tens of thousands of yaks from a very remote area of Tibet, Golok Jigdril Dzong, and take them down to the lowlands to fatten them up in feedlots where they are fed, well, last year I would have said American soybeans. It's probably going to be Brazilian soybeans now, and maybe Australian barley. Oh, no, they've just put a ban on Australian barley too, so it'll have to be Canadian barley. But anyway, it's imported. And then, of course, once these animals are fattened, they are slaughtered. And they're slaughtered to turn yaks into boxed, boned, chilled yak beef to be sent directly to Shanghai, because this entire project of industrializing the animal economy of Tibet is owned and financed by the Shanghai Municipal Corporation. So that to me has the same sort of dynamic as the Belt and Road. Whether China technically calls that part of the Belt and Road, I don't know. But it follows the same logic of industrialization, commodity chains, turning natural resources into packaged products for Chinese consumption and transporting them over huge distances to rich urban Chinese markets on the coast. So in that sense, it's very similar. And China is always hoping. Again, there was a story in the my favourite Chinese weekly, the Qinghai Science and Technology Weekly, only 2 days ago, about salmon farming in the lakes of Tibet, which they are trying to industrialise on a large scale. While at the same time, you know, so many of the lakes of Tibet, they talk about lyrically for their beauty and to attract tourists and all of the things we were talking about earlier. And in fact, many of them are now included in the national parks. And yet at the same time, we have, you know, an industrial agribusiness fishing industry. So that, to me, whether you call it Belt and Road or not, seems to me to have the same sort of logic, at least.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, what are the foreign governments are doing to protect the environment in Tibet, and what are the governments, are they doing enough to protect the Tibet's environment or to stop the Chinese government's destruction of Tibet's environment?
Again, a very interesting question, because if you depopulate the landscape, you are removing the people who have traditionally cared for sacred areas, sacred lakes, sacred mountains, for wildlife. And yes, Tibetans did occasionally hunt, and there were always lamas who would, you know, sternly remind Tibetans that, you know, if you just, for the sake of your ego or to have a beautiful fur trim to your chuba, you know, go and shoot animals, then, you know, you will suffer terribly in future lives. And so there was always this sort of back and forth. Removing the traditional custodians of the land could conceivably be justifiable if China had some alternative program for caring for the land. But do they? China uses climate change as both something to blame the nomads for, when in fact desertification and degradation may be part of, you know, a global trend. And yet at the same time, they insist that once you remove the people and more grass grows, then nature will by itself heal itself. So you don't need people on the ground to actually do the work of revegetation, nor in the areas in Kham, in the steep forested valleys where the forest was all cut, nor do you need Tibetans on the ground to do the work of reforestation. China instead simply drops seeds from aeroplanes on the bare earth slopes in the hope that, you know, they will just sort of magically grow into trees. Well, it doesn't work like that. If you cut down all the trees so there is no longer any protective canopy, then even if a seed strikes the earth and shoots and sends down roots and starts to grow, when winter comes, the frosts are so severe in the absence of a protective forest canopy that the seedlings die. For there to be successful reforestation, you actually need people on the ground. You need Tibetans living in Tibet, not herded away into concrete settlements on the edges of cities. So whether China has all the jug, it has all the propaganda, it has all the scientific papers and research and institutions, and will no doubt be applauded worldwide when it does finally announce the creation of these new national parks. But I do question whether on the ground they actually have the resources or even the interest to do the difficult, slow, labour-intensive work of reseeding the grasslands, revegetating degraded areas, and the same thing in the forests.
Mhm. So over there, what are the role of the foreign governments?
Well, foreign governments have very little role in Tibet these days. China explicitly reduced or even eliminated the role of foreign aid donors, whether private NGOs, environmental NGOs, they all got squeezed out by Chinese suspicious minds who didn't quite know what they were meant to be suspicious of, but all the propaganda directives they were getting from above were telling them to be suspicious. And the same goes for foreign aid. There is a limited amount of foreign aid. The Australian government, for example, has been introducing new varieties of cattle into Tibet, but these tend to be, pretty small scale. And I remember, way back in 2006, the wonderfully named David Dollar. Isn't that a wonderful name for a World Bank boss? David Dollar, who was the head of the World Bank in China for many years, just told me that, China just said bluntly, you are not to do any more projects in Tibet, because after the World Bank ran into trouble way back in 1999 with the project to send lots of Hui Muslim settlers into a remote area of Qinghai, and the World Bank finally decided it wasn't such a good idea after all, after a lot of controversy. And after that, China punished them and said, okay, you're never allowed to anywhere near Tibet ever again. So the entire overseas development assistance machinery has really done very, very little in Tibet. The Asian Development Bank does occasionally build a segment of a railway into Tibet. The United Nations Development Programme has been involved in the planning of the national parks, especially Sanjiangyuan, and also what China calls the Qilianshan, the Dolari mountains on the northern perimeter of the northernmost edge of Tibet. So there is still some international involvement. But China takes pride these days on being an international donor, not a recipient of aid, but a donor, a provider of aid. It's just part of China's national assertiveness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Thank you, Gabriel. Now we have one last question, and so I think which is very practical. So over here we have one question saying that after seeing how China is misusing Tibetan environment, is there any practical ways in our daily life we can fight against it and try to change it for better in favor of real protection of nature?
Yes, look, that's again a good question, and hopefully it gives us something constructive to finish with. There are Tibetans inside Tibet who quietly and skillfully work within China's grand schemes, grand policies, grand propaganda phrases, and manage to do something practical on the ground. And in a couple of quite remote areas in Yushu Prefecture, there is a very skillful NGO which has official approval, works closely with professional environmentalists in Peking University called Shanshui. And they deliberately took a Chinese name that means mountains and rivers, and because that evokes classical Chinese water painting art, of mountains and rivers, so it's all very, very Chinese. And they run eco tours. They run tours for Westerners who are willing to, pay a premium price for the privilege of going out on patrol into very rugged, difficult and remote areas, one of the few areas where there is a real possibility that you might even see a snow leopard, as well as other endangered wildlife, wild yaks, brown bears, gazelles, antelopes, wild asses, etc., etc. And you stay in Tibetan homes. So the benefit is to the local Tibetan community, and this organisation with remarkable skill despite all of the political complexities also gets regular coverage in Chinese official media as people doing something good, and we'll put a little link to that on our Ruko website so that people can follow through on that if they want to pursue that. So yes, despite all of the political dramas and the propaganda, there are still skillful Tibetans on the ground doing some very constructive things.
Mm-hmm. And we, being outside Tibet, what can we do in our daily life to protect the Tibet's environment? Do you think that is there any other ways like people who are outside Tibet can do to protect the environment in Tibet?
Learning the propaganda is in itself a contribution because, as I said, inside Tibet, people also struggle to understand, even if the propaganda is presented to them in Tibetan, in their mother tongue, it's still incomprehensible. But let's also remember that the two United Nations conventions that we talked about, the Climate Change Convention and the Biodiversity Convention, are both due to have major meetings of all signatory countries, the Conference of the Parties, the COP in UN jargon, either late this year or sometime next year. The dates are not entirely certain, obviously. Now, each of those conventions, biodiversity and climate, have lots and lots of preparatory meetings in various cities around the world. They have lots of scientific organisations, lots of advisors, lots of government delegations and government departments of countries where Tibetans live, who are used to being lobbied, open to, in democracies, to people, putting a case. So if Tibetans, especially if Tibetans get more and more confident in getting a handle on the jargon, the campaign slogans, and seeing through them and helping their own governments to understand what China means by these propaganda slogans, then I think we certainly have opportunity in whatever country we live in to influence the outcomes of those two specific conferences coming up in the next year, year and a half, on biodiversity and on climate.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. And I'm sure, our viewers have also learned a lot, and we are really inspired by your work, your knowledge. And I would request our viewers to also go back to Gabriel's website, ruko.org, and then his presentation. He has written an article. The presentation that he has made right now is available in his website. And so, as Gabriel said, to educate ourselves regarding the Chinese propaganda, and then trying to influence your own government, and attending international conferences are the one of the few things that we can do to protect the environment in Tibet. And thank you so much, Gabriel.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And now I would hand over to Mandy.
Thank you, Lobsang, and thank you again so much, Gabriel, for that amazing talk. We had lots of people thanking you for the talk, and lots of people giving comments on how interesting it is to be able to have this information to really kind of unpack these messages that we kind of are bombarded with all the time, and we just take as they're written, as opposed to what they really mean. So it's really interesting to hear you kind of start to unpack that for us, and make sure that we understand it a lot more. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we have run on from where we were, which makes me feel as though we undoubtedly need to invite you back, not only to do more of this unpacking of this propaganda, and this very serious propaganda that China is pushing at the moment, but to talk about a wealth of the other bits of research that you've done and the analysis that you have, because we do know that you have so much knowledge, and we are always really grateful to be able to pick your brains about this information. So please do come back and speak with us again, and we'll certainly arrange that during these series of talks.
Thank you, Andy. I'd love to.
That would be amazing. I mean, the next couple of talks we have one on damming the Brahmaputra, and then we're going to have another one which is on environmental conservation. But I think we'll speak to you, Gabriel, and find out some of the key issues that you think we should be talking to our audience about, and get you back over the next couple of months.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to really quickly show my screen to the audience again. There have been a couple of questions about what more can be done. Obviously, it's very tricky to do stuff on Tibet's environment, because we can't be in Tibet to do it physically. However, there are a wealth of Tibet groups around the world that are working on campaigns. There are numerous actions that are happening. If you visit the website, which is tibetclimatecrisis.org, not only is there a whole load of information about the situation, about damming, about the climate crisis, and how Tibet is part of that conversation, but also about the forced nomad resettlement, about mining. There are a number of different petition actions. One of them is directed to the Human Rights Commissioner, who, as far as we're aware, is making plans to have a visit to China, and we are pressing that she obviously go to Tibet during that visit, and to go and visit Tibetan nomads areas. So please do go and visit the actions page and join one of those actions. But also, as I was saying, there are Tibet groups around the world who are working on this issue, and there will undoubtedly be a group in your area that's doing that. There is a Who We Are page, and there are links to groups in different countries that are running environment campaigns. There's the Australia Tibet Council, for instance. There's Free Tibet in the UK. There's one in Brazil. So please do visit the Who We Are page and try and find a group in your area, because by joining a group in your country, you will undoubtedly be given opportunities to take part in actions that will be specific to your country. Maybe, as Gabriel was saying, finding out more about what's happening with governments and when the COPs are taking place, etc. And I also just lastly wanted to really quickly show you Gabriel's blog, rucor.org. Not only are there really recent blogs, but it goes all the way back to 2011. So there's, I can't tell you how much information there is on there, but it's a wealth of analysis and reviews. So please do visit and work your way through some of these really incredible articles that Gabriel has spent so much time putting together for us. And again, just lastly, a huge thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for joining us all the way from Australia. And thank you, Lobsang, for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll see you all again soon. Thank you to everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.